My name's also Ben. That's about it, though. That's all we have in common. You spoke a lot about how the crime and a lot of issues in America come with having sex out of wedlock and having basically broken up families. I was wondering your opinion on mass incarceration in this country and how that affects and ties into victimization, specifically related to black and brown people, but I'll get there in a second. America has 25% of the world's prison population with 5% of the world's population. So obviously a lot of your families where kids go wrong, they don't have the support systems. That's why their fathers or their mothers are in prison. And you can look at very concrete examples of ways where the law has not been applied equally to black versus white people. So one example of that is in 1986. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act, where they punished crack cocaine, which black people used more than white people, at a 100-to-1 rate, which was recently reduced to 18-to-1 under Barack Obama. So I don't see how you can claim that everyone is treating equally and no one is victimized on a systemic level when you have laws that punish one race that is more likely to use one type of drug more than another race, when it's actually been shown that among kids our age, white people and suburban kids are more likely to use drugs in schools than black inner city kids.
Okay, so there's a lot there, and you're right, we disagree on everything. So, so to begin with, I don't believe in the concept of mass incarceration because that implies that the police are going into black communities with a lasso, rounding people up and taking them to jail for no reason. I don't think that's happening. Every person who is in jail has had a trial or a plea. The idea that people are just being grabbed and thrown into prison to keep alive some sort of prison industrial complex where the prison masters are the ones running the system, I don't see evidence of that. As far as the 1986 law, I think that it's important to put this into context. And the context is that that law was originally pressed by black legislators from inner cities who were sick of watching crack cocaine destroying their communities. And the reason for the disparity is because crack was more easily distributable and significantly more effective than powder cocaine. It is also the fact that the vast majority of people who are distributing and using crack cocaine were black. You know, it's a drug that the vast majority of people who distribute and use are white? Crystal meth. Guess what the penalty is for 1 ounce of crystal meth versus 1 ounce of crack cocaine? They are identical. They are identical because they are easily distributed and they are distributed in similar forms. So the idea that this was just some sort of attempt to grab black people off the street and throw them in jail for no reason so we could have a permanent underclass of people with no fathers, this seems to me like a giant conspiracy theory with little evidence to support it. As far as the idea that these communities would be better if we just release people onto the streets. So I think it's important, again, to note the statistics here. The fact is the vast majority of people who are in jail for drug crimes are in for distribution, not merely for use. The idea that it's a black kid who's just smoking crack on the street who's getting picked up by the cops and thrown in jail, the justice system doesn't have time for that. Okay, the vast majority of even possessions that are pled down from distributions. Now, I've said earlier, I'm not in favor of the drug war. Okay, but I can tell you something. The people who are currently acting in criminal fashion in the drug war aren't going to be out acting as model citizens as a general rule. A lot of those people are going to be committing other crimes because this has been the history of the United States. When you make a substance illegal, the people who are criminals were criminals before and they're criminals after. Al Capone was not going to turn into a banker after Prohibition ended. And the same thing is true for a lot of the people who are committing criminal acts by distributing illicit substances. So I think that to pretend that the epidemic of single motherhood is going to end, all these guys are just going to decide, you know what, I've decided to marry that girl, I'm going to stay home, and it's going to be like Leave It to Beaver. When they were dealing crack on the corner to 12-year-old kids the day before, I think that's a little bit of a myth.
Yeah, I want to respond to one specific point. You were saying the idea that cops are going into black communities and lassoing up black people is completely ridiculous. How would you explain the amount of black people in jail currently?
Higher numbers of black people committing crimes.
Well, that's not the case.
It is absolutely the case.
Keep going. It's been statistically shown that white people use drugs just as much as black
people. And as I said, people are generally not arrested for using drugs. They're generally arrested for drug distribution in the drug war.
Do white people not distribute drugs?
Well, they don't in terms of proportionality with regard to, I mean, the idea that, again, you need to show me the statistics on drug distribution. So the burden is on you to prove the disparity, not on me to prove the non-disparity.
I don't see how either of us can have, we should have an equal distribution of trying to prove the disparity.
Well, you're the one who's accusing the criminal justice system of wild injustice. Again, I don't have the statistics in front of me, so it's hard for me to cite statistics on that particular aspect of drug distribution, but you'd have to show that there are a bunch of white people who are distributing drugs to the same extent as the black people in jail, and then tell me that they're not being treated equally. You can't just suggest that drug use is equal to drug distribution, because statistically it's not.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, so I just wanted to start by thanking the College Republicans, Young America's Foundation, and of course Ben Shapiro. As like an immigrant, a Muslim, fairly liberal person, I think this is probably the best event that I've been able to access, just because I'm not sitting in the audience and nodding for an hour.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so I really do appreciate the platform for free dialogue. I think it's extremely important for there to be free speech, so the good ideas sort of crowd out the bad ones. The reason I'm kind of here today is because, while I was sitting there, and I've noticed this in a lot of your videos, which I do spend some time watching.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Definitely entertaining, yeah. So, like yesterday, right before coming here, or before I slept, I watched you on Piers Morgan talking about gun control. I heard you for an hour today, and I think what I realized is, I think the first step is talking about free speech, and I think the left can definitely work on that. The second step is using solid, sound, evidence for your speech, so that truly you have good ideas crowding out the bad. And I just wanted to take issue with a few things that you mentioned that I felt were a bit more sensational, a bit more, I know you're from like a lawyer background, so I can see.
No, go for it.
Yeah, so like you mentioned for rape on college campuses from 1995 to 2002 was a statistic you used.
Because those are the last available statistics from the DJS.
Sure. So there's current statistics that you think have methods that are unjustified because it's self-identified, but that's contemporary, and you're looking at something that started 20 years ago, and then making up for the caveat that, okay, it's self-identified, so it might not actually reach that amount. So what I'm saying is clearly we don't have sound data on this, and maybe not all of the self-identified reports are justified, but using a statistic that's 20 years old, even if it's the most contemporary one that you have, is, I think, unsound in terms of academic.
So I agree with you. I'd like to have better statistics. Now let me ask you a question on that. Do you think that the rape rate in the United States on college campuses is closer to 6 in 1,000 or 250 in 1,000?
I definitely think it's somewhere in between, and I don't think I have.
No, but I mean, like, if you had to try and peg a number. I mean, I understand that I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here.
Sure. I'd like to iterate. I'm not like a scientist or a statistician, and I don't claim to or posture to be, and I don't think you should either. If you don't have statistics,
do you think that it has increased 10,000%?
What I'm saying is, for you to criticize a certain community of using a statistic, 1 out of 5, as sensational or ridiculous,
because the people who actually created that statistic say that it's being misused.
Sure, and you're using a statistic that's 20 years old.
Because it's the best statistic available. Again, if you're willing to give me better statistics, I am more than willing to hear them. No, and as I've said, if you provide me new evidence, I'm more than willing to change my mind.
Fair, yeah. No, I don't think I have the political knowledge to debate that. So like, just a couple things. So moving forward, I think you talked about, you said, like, you mentioned Jim Crow laws and slavery for what kind of pushed black people back, and you said, okay, this is in the past. Again, this is an example of taking the opposition's argument, making a caricature of it, and dropping it down real fast. Everyone knows about Jim Crow. Everyone knows about slavery. Not as many people know about, for example, redlining in Chicago in the 1960s that the CBL had to push out by 1964. These kinds of systems have been entrenched for years. I think most people have read Ta-Nehisi Coates' article on how this has developed a system of entrenchment for these communities. Even today, under Rahm Emanuel, who's a Democrat and I think is wrong, implements TIF increment financing that takes money out of western and southern Chicago and reappropriates them to places that don't really need it as much. Clearly there's a lack of funding. He closed 47 schools over the past years. What I'm basically trying to say is there's a lot of factors going on in these communities that are predominantly black, Hispanic, etc. And for you to simply say that, okay, Jim Crow happened 50 years ago, racism hasn't increased, is a bit, I think, again, insincere, because I don't believe that racism has, I do believe that racism has decreased, and we're saying the N-word less, sure, but I don't think that racism at a systemic level has decreased, because the same communities that were affected in the 1960s, those people are still alive.
That's a wild accusation. I mean, I'm with you all the way up till the end. When you say there's a lot of complexity to these arguments, I agree there's a lot of complexity to these arguments. Yeah, I'll tell you where there's no complexity, and that is the only way you are going to get out of the current problems that you are in is by relying on yourself to make good decisions. That's not to say that there aren't obstacles, and if there are obstacles that you can name, I'm more than happy to stand there and fight them with. If you can show me evidence of redlining by a bank in which a black person and a white person are being treated unequally with exactly the same application, I will stand next to you and root for them to be prosecuted in court, because that's illegal under the Civil Rights Act. But if you're going to suggest that racism has not decreased over the last 50 years, it's just sort of hidden, there is no evidence to suggest that whatsoever.
Sorry, I might have misspoke. So yeah, I agree with you. That was my bad. I don't think racism has increased. It's absolutely decreased. But I think that the institutions that existed 50 years ago haven't really vanished. The title character of the Atlantic story, Clyde Ross, I went to his house. He is experiencing the same things that he experienced 50 years ago. The government will come by. And I know you say that the government shouldn't fix this, and I agree. I'm just saying the government shouldn't make it worse. The government comes by. They say, hey, we're providing subsidies for these communities to become better. You can use it for paint for your house, better windows, anything that the public can see to make it look better. But he doesn't have heating in his house, but he can't use it for that because that's just not the system that's in place.
Right.
All I'm saying is
The government sucks, yeah.
But I totally agree with you on that. But all I'm trying to say is
So come to the dark side.
I guess all I'm trying to say is I definitely agree that these are complicated. I think the left and the right, they take small points and they sensationalize them to create a political platform. I would just appreciate it, since you are a journalist and not a politician, to do the same kind of due diligence when you really offer input, because a lot of people listen to you, a lot of people respect your opinion.
Well, okay, so again, the article that you're citing by Ta-Nehisi Coates, I haven't actually read that article, so I'm not going to claim knowledge of an article that you've read and I haven't. So I'll take your account of the situation for what it is, which is there's some guy who is apparently being victimized by the government because the government will only give him subsidies for X, Y, and Z, but he actually wants it for A, B, and C. My answer to that is that it's not the government's job to provide subsidies for anyone. And if the government is mal-appropriating subsidies, I object to that regardless of the race of the person. Like, I object to subsidies to the ethanol boondoggle in Iowa, which is basically white people. I object to subsidies to Wall Street. I object to all these subsidies. I don't think the government should be involved at all. And this fellow who was victim to pretend that systematized discrimination under Jim Crow that was happening in 1960 is the same as a badly run government program in 2017 because they want to give you money for your windows but not for your water heater. Again, I don't see the relationship between the two. And to suggest that the banks are operating in the same way now as they were operating in 1960, I don't see the evidence for that either. I'm happy to look at evidence, but I need actual evidence. I can't just base it on headlines.